On the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, a German soldier in a concrete bunker above a Normandy beach looked down through his gun sight, and for just a moment, he laughed. He had reason to. In front of him was the most heavily fortified coastline on Earth, mines by the 100,000, belts of barbed wire, a sea wall, steel obstacles waiting under the tide, and behind it all, his bunker, poured in reinforced concrete, with a machine gun that could sweep the whole beach. And crawling out of the surf toward him came a joke, a column of the strangest tanks he had ever seen. One had no gun at all, just a great spinning drum of chains out front, beating the sand like a farmer threshing wheat. One was draped in a giant roll of canvas and logs. One looked like it was carrying a bridge on its back. They were slow. They were ugly. They looked like farm machinery that had wandered onto a battlefield by mistake. He had never been told what they were. Nothing in his training explained them, so he laughed. Then the chain tank reached the minefield in front of his wire, and the mines began going off one by one, harmlessly, beaten to death by the whirling flails, opening a clean lane straight toward him. Then a second tank stopped and threw a 40-pound bomb the size of a dustbin straight into the base of the bunker next to his. And then a third tank, low and heavy, crawled to within 100 yards and breathed out a rope of fire. The men who built these machines had been laughed at too, by newspapers, by other generals, and most of all, by the British Army itself, which had thrown the man behind them out twice and once reduced him to a corporal. This is the story of Hobart's Funnies, a menagerie of tanks so strange the soldiers named them after a joke. Built by a general the establishment had decided was finished, dug out of forced retirement by Winston Churchill personally, and handed one impossible task: build the machines that could crack open a fortified beach when everyone knew a fortified beach could not be cracked. And there is a second thread to this story, harder to hear. Not every Allied beach used them. One of the 5 landing beaches went in almost without the Funnies. Its name was Omaha. And what happened there, compared to the beaches where the freak tanks led the way, is one of the most uncomfortable comparisons of the entire war. Historians still argue over exactly how much the machines were worth. The men on the sand did not have the luxury of arguing. But to understand why Britain built a circus of clown tanks in the first place, you have to understand one bloody afternoon, 2 years earlier, that taught the Allies exactly how a landing dies. On the 19th of August, 1942, a mostly Canadian force raided the French port of Dieppe. It was a disaster. The tanks that landed were stopped dead on the shingle, unable to climb the seawall, picked apart where they sat. Of roughly 6,000 men who went ashore, more than half were killed, wounded, or captured in a single morning. Dieppe taught the Allies a lesson written in blood. You could not simply land tanks on a defended beach and hope. The beach itself was a killing machine, built in layers, each one designed to stop you before you reach the next. First, the sea. Ordinary tanks cannot swim. They have to be carried in and dropped in shallow water, exactly where the enemy guns are ranged. Then, the obstacles. Steel stakes and hedgehogs, many topped with mines, laid to tear the bottom out of a landing craft. Then, the beach itself, sown with mines and wire, every yard covered by machine guns. Then, the sea wall, often too high and too steep for a tank to climb. And finally, the bunkers, reinforced concrete, feet thick, that a normal tank shell would simply chip. Every one of these had to be beaten, in order, under fire, in minutes. No standard tank on Earth could do more than one of these jobs, and most could do none of them. By 1943, the planners looking at the Atlantic Wall faced a simple, brutal arithmetic. To take these beaches, they needed machines that did not yet exist. The man who would build them was, at that moment, a corporal in the Home Guard. Major General Percy Hobart was one of the most brilliant tank minds Britain ever produced, and one of the most difficult men to have in a room. Before the war, he had built and trained the force that became the Desert Rats, the finest armoured division in the British Army. He saw, earlier and more clearly than almost anyone, that the tank would decide the next war. And for that, the army got rid of him. His ideas were too radical, his manner too abrasive, and the old guard too threatened. In 1940, he was forced into retirement. This general, this pioneer of armoured warfare, put on the uniform of a lance corporal and stood guard on the English coast with the Home Guard, waiting for an invasion with a rifle and an armband. He might have stayed there, forgotten, if Churchill had not read a newspaper article about him. The Prime Minister intervened personally. Hobart was pulled out of the ranks, given a division, trained it into one of the best in the army, and was very nearly pushed out again by the same enemies before Churchill intervened a second time and gave him the command that would make his name. The 79th Armoured Division, and one brief, unlike any other in the war. Invent the tanks that can open a beach. What Hobart built was a menagerie. There was a tank that could swim, a Sherman wrapped in a tall canvas screen that displaced enough water to float it, propellers turning at the back so it could launch from the sea and come ashore under its own power, arriving as a tank exactly where the enemy least expected one. There was a tank to beat the minefields. The Crab, a Sherman with a rotating drum on two arms out front, hung with heavy chains. As it drove, the drums spun, and the chains hammered the ground, setting off buried mines ahead of the tank, flailing a safe lane through a minefield at walking pace. There was a tank to break the bunkers, the AVRE carrying a stubby mortar called the Petard, which lobbed a 40-pound charge the men called the Flying Dustbin. Its range was pathetic, barely 80 yards, so it had to crawl in close under fire. But at close range, it could collapse a concrete strongpoint that shells bounced off. There was a tank that carried a bridge and unfolded it over a seawall or a ditch. A tank that unrolled a giant reel of matting to lay a firm road across soft clay so the vehicles behind would not sink. And a tank that breathed fire, the Churchill Crocodile, towing a trailer of fuel, throwing a jet of flame more than 100 yards, a weapon so horrifying that bunkers often surrendered the moment they saw it coming. The soldiers looked at this collection of drums and flails and flame and canvas, and they laughed, and they gave it a name: Hobart's Funnies. They were not the only ones laughing. When the designs were shown to the American command, most of them were politely declined. The reasons were partly practical: time, production, training, and this is a point worth being careful about because the story is often told as pure arrogance, and it was not that simple. But the outcome was that the Funnies would go in force on the British and Canadian beaches and would be almost absent from one American beach in particular. By the spring of 1944, Hobart had done the impossible. He had a full division of specialized armor, trained in secret, ready to do jobs no tank had ever done. Whether it was worth anything at all would be settled in a few hours on a single morning. At dawn on the 6th of June, the invasion hit 5 beaches, 2 of them tell the whole story. On the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the Funnies went in with the first waves. The swimming tanks came ashore and gave the infantry armor from the first minute. The crabs flailed lanes through the minefields, and the men walked up the cleared paths behind them. The AVREs crawled to the sea wall and blew gaps in it, and threw their flying dustbins into the bunkers. The crocodiles burned the strong points out. Where a defense held, a freak tank was sent to break it, one specialized machine for each specialized problem, exactly as Hobart had planned. The beaches were not easy, men still died, but the defenses were opened, in order, and the infantry got off the sand and inland. And then there was Omaha. Omaha was an American beach, and it went in with almost none of the Funnies. It did use the swimming tanks, but they were launched too far out, into a rough sea they were never designed for, and nearly all of them flooded and sank on the way in, taking their crews down with them. So the infantry landed on the most heavily defended beach of the five, with almost no armor at all. No flails to clear the mines, no dustbin throwers for the bunkers, no fire to burn out the guns. Omaha became a slaughter. The men were pinned at the waterline for hours, cut down in the open by guns that nothing had silenced. The casualties there were worse than on all the British and Canadian beaches combined. Now, historians are careful here, and so should we be. The Funnies were not the only difference between the beaches. Omaha had higher bluffs, a tougher garrison, and worse luck with the weather and the currents. It would have been a hard beach no matter what. But the comparison hangs over D-Day and will not go away, because the one beach that went in without the machines everyone had laughed at was the one beach that turned into a massacre. By nightfall, the Allies were ashore in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress line Hitler had called impregnable, had been breached in a single day. And the strange tanks that soldiers had named after a joke had done exactly what their disgraced creator promised they would. Go back to the German soldier in the bunker, the one who laughed. He had been looking at the future of war and did not recognize it because it looked ridiculous, slow, ugly, wrong. A tank with no gun. A tank made of chains. A tank that carried a bridge. He had simply failed to understand that ridiculous was the only thing that could get up that beach alive. Percy Hobart never got the fame his machines earned. He had been thrown out of his own army, twice, and reduced to a corporal, and even after D-Day proved him right, the establishment never fully forgave him for being right so much earlier than everyone else. His tanks opened the door to Europe. His name stayed a footnote. But he was not the first British genius his own side tried to bury. A year before D-Day, another awkward, brilliant Englishman brought an idea to the head of Bomber Command, an idea for a bomb that could skip across water like a stone. The response was 3 words. Tripe of the wildest description. That story, and what that bomb did to 2 dams Germany swore were unbreakable, is already on this channel.